Welcome back to Sacred Arc, a podcast about life, loss, and the soul in between. I'm Kimberly, intuitive grief guide, death doula, licensed esthetician, and whether I wanted to be or not, a lifelong student of grief. Today's episode is here because words fail around grief. Not because people are unkind, not because they don't care, but because most of us were never taught how to be with pain we can't fix. We weren't taught how to sit with grief. We were taught how to move past it, or minimize it, or tidy it up, or make it quieter. And so when grief enters the room, people reach for language that feels familiar, even when it lands wrong. They reach for optimism, for reassurance, for meaning, for religion, maybe even for perspective or for urgency. Not because those things actually help grief, but because they help the speaker survive the discomfort of being near something that has no solution. When we're young, grief is often dismissed, sometimes gently, sometimes abruptly. We're told, don't cry, you're okay, be brave. Or they wouldn't want you to be sad, everything will be fine. Those phrases don't come from cruelty, they come from fear. Fear of helplessness, fear of loss. Fear of staying present with something that can't be fixed. So we grow up believing that sadness should be short, that grief should be private, that pain should be corrected, and no one teaches us how to stay. How to listen without redirecting. How to witness without narrating. How to say, this hurts without rushing to heal it. This episode exists because grief isn't actually fragile, but the way we've been taught to respond to it is. And because people who are grieving don't need better advice. They need safer company. They don't need phrases, they need permission. Permission to feel what they feel, to take the time they take, to grieve without performing strength, to be met without explanation. If you've ever been on the receiving end of words that didn't fit, words that tried to hurry you, comfort you, or explain your loss away, this episode is for you. And if you've ever found yourself not knowing what to say or saying something you later wished you hadn't, this episode is for you too. Because this isn't about blame. It's about learning how to meet grief with presence instead of panic, with honesty instead of scripts, and with humanity instead of fear. So before we talk about what not to say and what grief actually needs, I want to name this. Most people don't struggle with grief language because they lack empathy. They struggle because they were never taught how to be with pain that can't be solved. There are certain things people say that come from good intentions but land like abandonment. Not because the words are evil, but because grief just makes people uncomfortable. And when they're uncomfortable, they reach for language that reassures them, not the person who is grieving. And when the grieving person is left to manage everyone else's comfort, something subtle occurs inside the griever. A tightening, a quiet withdrawal, a decision to not share again. So I want to talk about some of the most common things people hear and why they so often hurt. Not to shame anyone, but to give language to what so many people feel and never say out loud. One of the most common is, how are you doing? This seems harmless, even kind. But after loss, this question can feel impossible to answer because the real answer is usually, I'm not okay, and I don't know how to explain that in a sentence that won't make you uncomfortable. So people say, I'm okay, I'm hanging in there, doing the best I can, not because it's true, but because it's safer than opening something that doesn't have a neat ending. What often helps more is, how is your grief today? Or, you don't have to summarize, I'm here. The next one, at least they lived a long life, or at least they made it to a certain age. But there is no age where loss becomes painless. Time lived does not cancel attachment. Years shared do not erase absence. Inside the griever, this can sound like your pain should be smaller now. What helps instead is, they mattered. Or, I can hear how much they meant to you. The next one is, you should be grateful for the time you had. But gratitude and grief are not opposites. You can be grateful and be devastated at the same time. You can cherish memories and ache for more. This phrase often creates confusion inside the griever, and they start to think, am I allowed to miss them if I'm thankful? What helps instead? I know loving them deeply makes this hurt more. It's time to move on, or even this will pass. These often land as pressure because grief doesn't move in straight lines and love does not expire. Inside the griever, this can create panic or shame, and they start thinking, am I doing this wrong? What helps instead is there's no timeline for this. You need to be strong, or you have to be strong for your spouse, your kids, your mom, whoever you're surviving for. This teaches people how to hide. It tells them your pain is inconvenient. Your honesty is too much. Many grievers hear this and decide, I won't cry here again. What helps instead is you don't have to hold it together with me. Time heals, or you'll be okay after a while, just give it time. But time alone doesn't heal grief. What does heal grief is safety, language, permission, and presence. Without those, time just teaches people how to perform. So what helps instead is this still matters even now. Stay busy, don't think about it. But avoidance isn't healing, it's postponement. Grievers often feel disbelief when they hear this, and a little anger, because grief lives in the body, not the calendar. So what helps instead is it's okay if this comes and goes. I know how you feel. Even when said with empathy, this can feel minimizing, because no one else has lived this loss in this body with this history at this moment. Everyone's circumstances around a loss are different, and inside the griever often thinks, no, you don't. You can't possibly understand what I'm feeling. So what helps instead is I can't fully understand, but I'm here. Look on the bright side, or don't be sad. There's so much to be grateful for. I heard this a lot at Thanksgiving, the first year I lost my son. But these phrases can make people feel ashamed for hurting, as if sadness is a failure of perspective, as if pain means you're ungrateful, but grief isn't negativity. It's love responding to loss. Others have it worse than you. But pain is not a competition. And this often teaches people to silence themselves, to shrink their grief so others can tolerate it. But what helps instead is you don't have to justify why this hurts. The next one is particularly harmful. You need to stop feeling sorry for yourself and move on. But grief is not self-pity. It's not indulgence. It's not weakness. It's a natural response to rupture. It was their time. This one can sound calm on the surface, almost accepting. But inside the griever, it can land as, so my loss was inevitable, my longing doesn't matter, or there was nothing sacred about wanting more time. Especially when the death was sudden, violent, or premature. This phrase can feel like an attempt to make chaos orderly. What helps more is this shouldn't have happened, or I wish there had been more time. If I went through what you did, I don't know if I'd still be here. This one often lands as praise, but it carries a heavy, invisible burden. Inside, the griever may hear, now I have to keep surviving so you don't feel scared. Or now my pain has become a benchmark for strength. Now I can't fall apart. Instead of being supported, the griever becomes the container for other people's fear. What helps more would be something like, you shouldn't have had to be this strong. The next two I've heard from grievers who have experienced loss through suicide. It was obviously what they wanted, or they chose this. These statements can feel especially violent to those left behind. They often erase the complexity of mental illness, the ambivalence many people feel before dying, and the reality that suicide is often about escape from pain, not a desire for death. Inside the griever, this can create anger, shame, defensiveness, and a deep sense of being misunderstood. What helps more would be something like, I'm so sorry they were hurting, or this is incredibly hard and painful. he's with Jesus now, or God only gives you what you can handle. And what the griever often feels is a sudden pressure to accept comfort they didn't consent to. Distance if their faith doesn't match that statement. Guilt for still feeling devastated when they're supposed to feel peace. And anger that spiritual meaning is being placed on their loss without permission. For some people of faith, this may eventually feel comforting, but often not in the early days, and not when it's said instead of acknowledging pain. It can actually cause distance from faith altogether. What helps instead would be something like, I don't have words, I'm just sorry. Your grief makes sense no matter what you believe. Or you don't have to find peace in this right now. Another one that gets said a lot is God needed another angel. And for some people, faith is grounding. For others, this phrase lands as spiritual bypassing, especially when spoken without knowing the person, the relationship, or the loss. What the griever feels is shock, rage, confusion, a deep sense of injustice. For parents, being told that God needed their child more than they did can feel devastating or even enraging. It implies the loss was necessary or intended. And many grievers are left thinking, why would a loving God need my child? These phrases can sound like, your grief is a lack of faith. Your pain should be soothed by belief. Your questions are inconvenient. What helps more is something like, I don't have spiritual answers, but I care about you. Or silence is often kinder than theology offered too quickly. They're in a better place, or at least they're not suffering anymore. This one is tricky because it can be true and it can still hurt. What it often misses is this. The person who died may be at peace, but the person left behind is not. And saying at least can feel like it minimizes the very real suffering of the living. Relief and grief can coexist, but relief does not cancel loss. They wouldn't want you to be sad. This one deserves to be named clearly. When someone said this about my son, someone who didn't even know him, it didn't comfort me. It felt like being asked to erase my love so other people could feel better. Grief is not disrespect. Sadness is not betrayal. And what helps instead is your sadness makes sense. Everything happens for a reason. This is one of the most common and one of the most painful. Because some things are not lessons. Some things are not gifts. Some things are simply devastating. Meaning, if it shows up later, if at all. So what helps instead is simply, this is unfair. You can always have more kids. This one needs to be said plainly. Children are not interchangeable. Love is not replaceable. And this often creates instant emotional distance. What helps instead is saying nothing and just being present. It's just a cat or it's just a dog when it's around pet loss. But for many people, animals are companions, they're anchors, their routine, their emotional safety, their unconditional presence. Minimizing that loss dismisses a very real bond. Because grief is not measured by species, it's measured by attachment. So what helps instead is, I'm so sorry, I know they mattered to you. Before I say this next one, I want to give a little context behind it. Each year on my son's birthday, we gather down in San Diego at his favorite beach and celebrate him. And a family friend came up to me, one that I'd never met before, and said, "How are you doing? Wow, this has to be so hard. Who do you think has it worse, you or his dad?" When I say I was stunned, I mean it. Because when it was said, it didn't feel like curiosity. It felt like grief being ranked, measured, judged, as if loss must be justified by comparison, as if my pain required permission. Inside that question landed as, I'm not allowed to grieve fully unless I win this invisible contest. But there is no scoreboard. And that question upset me the rest of the day. What helps more would be something like, I can't imagine how hard this is for you. When these things are said, many grievers don't correct the person. They don't argue, they don't explain, they simply remember. And later they may stop sharing. They may stop answering honestly, or they may stop showing up the same way or having the same relationship with that person. Not out of punishment, but out of self-protection. Distance isn't always rejection. Sometimes it's grief learning where it's safe. And grief that isn't witnessed often becomes heavier to carry alone. If you're grieving and someone has said one of these things to you, there's nothing wrong with you for feeling hurt, angry, or shut down. And if you've said one of these things, it doesn't mean you're a bad person. It means you were trying to help without being taught how. But grief doesn't need fixing, it just needs company. After talking about what doesn't help, I want to spend a little more time on what does. Because grief isn't asking for the right words. It isn't asking for wisdom. It isn't asking for optimism. Grief is simply asking for presence. Most of the harm around grief doesn't come from cruelty. It comes from misunderstanding what grief actually needs. We try to meet grief with solutions because solutions make us feel useful. But grief isn't a problem to solve. It's a reality to sit beside. Grief wants permission to exist exactly as it is without being rushed towards resolution. It doesn't want timelines. It doesn't want milestones. It doesn't want to be measured against someone else's healing. When someone says, take all the time you need and then disappears when that time extends, the message becomes, take time, but not that much. Grief wants permission to be nonlinear, to come back, to ebb and flow, to change shape. It wants to know it won't be abandoned just because it lasts longer than expected. Grief doesn't want to be managed. It doesn't want you to cheer it up. It doesn't want you to redirect it. It doesn't want you to make it productive. It wants someone who can sit in a room where nothing gets better and stay. Someone who doesn't require the grieving person to explain themselves, to regulate their emotions, to perform strength, or to make the moment lighter. Grief relaxes when it doesn't have to take care of anyone else. One of the deepest wounds in grief is when the world moves on and the person who was lost stops being spoken about. Grief wants remembrance, names, stories, ordinary mentions, not whispered, not avoided, not handled with gloves. Grief doesn't hurt because someone is remembered. It hurts when they're silently removed from the room. For many people, the most painful moments aren't anniversaries, they're gatherings where no one says the name anymore. But grief wants acknowledgement, not avoidance. Grief wants space to say, this hurts. This doesn't make sense. I don't know who I am now, or I don't know what I believe. It doesn't want to be rushed into meaning, or lessons, or silver linings. Grief wants more honesty than insight. When we tell people to stay positive or think differently, we ignore where grief actually resides, in the body. And grief wants rest, regulation, gentleness. Sometimes healing looks like sitting instead of talking, breathing instead of explaining, leaving early instead of pushing through, or canceling plans without guilt. Grief wants the body to feel safe enough to soften. Grief doesn't want to be compared to someone else's loss. It doesn't want ranking. It doesn't want perspective. It wants to know you don't have to justify why this hurts. Comparison teaches people to minimize themselves, but companionship teaches people they belong. Often the most supportive things are the simplest. I'm here. I don't know what to say, but I'm not going anywhere. Do you want company, distraction, or quiet? These aren't scripts, they're invitations, and sometimes grief doesn't want words at all. It wants presence without narration. So if you're grieving and people don't seem to know how to show up, it doesn't mean your grief is too much. It means our culture hasn't been taught how to stay. And if you're supporting someone who's grieving, you don't need the right phrase. You need the willingness to remain human in the face of pain. I want to pause here for a moment as we slow things down. I want to encourage you to take one slow breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. Just noticing where you're feeling this in your body today. Not trying to fix anything, just being present. Grief doesn't ask us how to fix it. It asks us to accompany it. And when grief is met with presence instead of pressure, something subtle begins to shift. Not because the pain disappears, but because it no longer has to be carried alone. This has been Sacred Arc. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll meet you again in the space between.